Hello, Archie Dunlop here with Talking Astrology with Archie on Wednesday, December the 6th, 2023. Today I want to talk about Boris Johnson. I have talked about him quite a lot since I started this channel in February, and yes, I want to talk about him again. And the question I want to ask you is, how are the history books going to judge him in the future? Of course, in the future there won't be history books, but whatever the equivalent will be, I mean, maybe people won't care about history in the future, but hypothetically, how will he be judged? So, many people in the UK can't stand him, particularly those on the left. They blame him for Brexit. They blame him for mishandling the COVID crisis. They blame him for his inability to handle the details of government. He sort of seemed, at times, perhaps a bit amateurish. He's running his country, a serious business, and during the COVID crisis, he allowed this party to take place at number 10 Downing Street, which in the end brought his premiership down. So is that what it's going to be about? Well, I do think that with COVID he was unlucky. I mean, I don't think that Boris was the kind of person you'd want to have perhaps as prime minister during the COVID crisis. He was kind of a bit indecisive. He didn't quite know how to respond. Was he going to be very loose, let people do what they like, or was he going to come down hard and bring in plenty of restrictions? He wasn't kind of created for that kind of job. But yeah, he was a bit unlucky. Then there's a thing which no one seems to blame him for, which I find really strange, which is Ukraine. Boris Johnson was a almost fanatical advocate for Britain's intervention in the war between Russia and Ukraine, which kind of effectively became a proxy war, with the US, NATO fighting Russia via Ukraine. And recently, like last sort of week or two, we've started to get an idea about what happened in the spring of 2022, when Russia and Ukraine were having very serious talks about ending the war. And these talks came very close to being successful. So to give you an idea of a problem, let me show you this website. It's a website for some publication called the European Conservative. I'm not saying I read it. I'm not saying I'm conservative. I'm just giving you a description of sort of what happened in the spring of 2022, and I think this website gives I think a good summary of it. So let me just read this. So this was an article sort of published November the 27th, 2023, about a week ago, and it's titled "Official: Johnson forced Kiev to refuse." Or Kiev, force Kiev to refuse Russian peace deal. And so he was Russia was ready to end the war and withdraw its troops in exchange for Ukrainian neutrality just a few months after the invasion began, and was refused partly because of ex-British PM Boris Johnson, who pressured Kiev into continuing the fight. David Arahamaya, the leader of Ukraine's ruling party, confirmed in a recent interview published on Friday, November the 24th. The lawmaker is not only leading the parliamentary faction of Zelensky's Servant of the People party, but was also appointed at the head of the Ukrainian delegation during the initial tentative peace talks in March and April hosted by Turkey. So Russia's ultimate goal was to press Ukraine into neutrality, Aramea explained, adding that all other requests, like the elusive denazification, were essentially empty cosmetics, and neutrality would have been enough for Russia to agree to withdraw beyond the February the 24th front lines. They, Russia, were ready to end the war if we took neutrality, as Finland once did, and made commitments that we would not join NATO. This was the key point. The lawmaker recalled that while the negotiations between Kiev and Moscow were underway in Istanbul, Johnson unexpectedly arrived in Kiev on April the 9th, 2022, telling Zelensky that he shouldn't sign anything with them at all, and let's just fight. So this is very serious, I would have thought. And Johnson and the West scuppered the talks that Russia was having with Ukraine in Istanbul, which came very, very close to being successful. And really, Ukraine would have got a pretty good deal, particularly when you look at what's going on in Ukraine right now. And it would seem that Boris Johnson was the front man. He went to Kiev on April the 9th, 2022. And my feeling is, in terms of the history books, that he will get a pretty bad press. He will be strongly criticised, but not for COVID, not for his party in Downing Street, but for his actions in terms of scuppering the talks in Istanbul. This is how I believe it's going to happen. And yeah, history is not going to look kindly at Boris Johnson because of this. And this leads me to the astrology. I mean, I want to look at Boris Johnson's horoscope from the perspective of his support for Ukraine, for the way he helped disrupt and scupper these talks between Russia and Ukraine in Istanbul, and what was actually going on? Why did Boris Johnson behave like he did? And indeed, what was going on April the 9th? On April the 9th, 2022. So that's really what I want to look at in this video. But before I do that, I want to look at the astrology and I Ching for today, which is Wednesday, December the 6th, 2023. So let's have a look. There's Boris Johnson, top right. So let's see what's going on in terms of this chart. Now you will see that the moon is in Libra. Now this chart is set for New York, noon, December the 6th, 2023. So London time, the moon goes into Libra at 4:35 p.m. In New York, it's 11:35 a.m. In Los Angeles, 8:35 a.m. So if you're in Paris or Berlin, the moon will go into Libra at 5:35, sort of late afternoon. If you're in Australia, New Zealand, East Asia, then the moon will go into Libra tomorrow, Thursday. So yeah, so if you're in the Americas, really you've got the moon in Libra certainly during the whole of the afternoon and the evening, and if you're on the West Coast, then pretty much all day you've got the moon in Libra. So this is a change, the moon moving into Libra. So the moon was in Virgo. As we know, Virgo can be very focused on details, the material details, wanting to get everything right. Moon in Virgo can actually be quite sensitive to sort of pollutants, chemicals, wanting to eat foods that's wholesome, not contaminated, and can be quite fussy. So Moon moving from Virgo to Libra means there's a bit less fussiness around, not so much obsession about details. We can, start to communicate in a sort of in an easier way. And we can perhaps, Moon in Libra, a very sociable place for the Moon. And so we're going to want to get on with other people. We're going to try our hardest, in most cases, to create the right balance. We don't want to do anything to upset the apple cart. Virgo can upset the apple cart by using criticism, by just focusing on the details, upsetting people by nitpicking criticism. So yeah, Moon in Libra does provide some relief from all of that. And while the Moon moves into Libra, Mercury, you can see Mercury is at 519 Capricorn, and it is sesquiquadrate Uranus at 29 Taurus. So Mercury sesquiquadrate Uranus. We had this yesterday, but it seems to be it's even closer today. So Mercury is the way we communicate. Uranus is about disruption. So with the Moon in Libra, we might be trying our hardest to have a balanced approach to keep everyone happy, but somehow the things we say could still be very disruptive. Without even meaning to be disruptive, we could just say something, and then we have to look at the aftermath of what we've said, look at the chaos, and and the disruption. So be careful what you say with Mercury sesquiquadrate Uranus. On the other hand, Mercury is about thinking and reading, and we may come across ideas which are disruptive, but which might be quite exciting with this Mercury's sesquiquadrate Uranus. But probably the most important thing going on today, Wednesday, is something you can't immediately see from the chart. And it is this. It is Neptune is move stationary direct. So Neptune has been going backwards for some time. From the Earth's perspective, from the Sun's perspective, Neptune never goes backwards. So from the Earth's perspective, Neptune goes stationary direct. This is when it stops going backwards and then very slowly starts to move forward. And this actually happens London time at 1:20 p.m., 1:20 in the afternoon today. If you're in the Americas, it'll be in the morning. I'm not saying that the actual moment that Neptune goes stationary direct is important, but it's just to give you an idea that this thing has happened. So what does that mean? When I looked at the astrology for the week ahead, I put out the video a few days ago looking at the whole week. I did go into detail about Neptune going direct. It can make us more sensitive. Our dreams can be more vivid, but we might be more vulnerable to deception. We might be inclined to believe things which are complete nonsense. We have to be careful with water. You might associate Neptune going direct, particularly as Neptune's in Pisces, with water damage, with flooding, maybe with natural disasters, but especially natural disasters relating to water. Although last year, when Neptune went direct, we had I mean, as I've mentioned a couple of times, there was a flooding in Johannesburg where in a church, I think, or around a church, Johannesburg in South Africa, I think quite a lot of people were killed. I mean, it wasn't a huge mega disaster, but I think 8 or 9 people were killed, something like that. There was a volcanic issues in Indonesia, so it's that kind of thing. So, don't do anything stupid with water, your plumbing, sailing, boating, swimming. Okay, if you're in the Northern Hemisphere, then it's not really the kind of time we're going to go on boat trips, but perhaps in the Southern Hemisphere you have to be careful. If you're in Australia, I mean, where it's sort of high summer in Australia, is it? Something like that. So yeah, be careful with if you're doing stuff in or around water with Neptune going stationary direct. And also notice that when Neptune goes stationary direct at 1:20 p.m., the Moon is actually opposite. The Moon is opposite Neptune. So particularly around lunchtime in Western Europe, lunchtime, early afternoon, be careful. That's a time not to do anything stupid. That's the time to really make sure that you don't trip yourself up, you don't allow yourself to be deceived, and so on. But I should say, Neptune does go stationary direct every single year, and for most of us, it's not a big deal. It doesn't really affect us. So, I don't want to exaggerate its importance for us as individuals, but it's certainly would be interesting to see what's happening in the news around the time of Neptune stationing. Okay, that's the astrology for today, and what I want to do now is do my forecasts for the 12 signs for today, which is Wednesday, December the 6th, 2023. Aries. There are things you want to communicate to the wider world, and you think you know what you're talking about. But with Mercury making an 135-degree aspect to Uranus, the reaction might not be what you expect. So perhaps you should keep some of your thoughts to yourself. Elsewhere, someone new is moving into your life, or perhaps an existing relationship is entering a new chapter. Taurus. You can't be a lone operator. At least today you can't. You have to consider the people you're working with as well as their standards. And don't think that your approach is necessarily the best approach. With Venus, your ruler, moving further into Scorpio, the power balance is starting to go against you. But if you accept the situation, you'll be able to make the most of social and interpersonal opportunities. Gemini. You're feeling better able to express yourself, and some of the aggravation of the last few days is beginning to subside. There'll be places on your journey where you can genuinely enjoy yourself, and the moment of discovery could be particularly satisfying. Cancer. You're inclined to take a break. There has been a lot going on recently, and you can't expect non-stop action. In fact, there are things to do in your own home, and you may have to interact with members of your family, at least more than usual. But your presence is very calming, and troubled minds can be settled. Leo. You're expected to be very precise, especially in terms of communication. Every word matters, and at every step you'll have to explain yourself. At the same time, you need to be aware of the formality that underlies social relationships, and you need to understand the specific ways in which people want to be treated, and perhaps addressed as well. Virgo, you feel that you've got everything under control and that you can follow your creative impulses, but there are outside disturbances, and perhaps it will be suggested that you should do things differently. So if you value your independence, it might be a good idea to keep your own company and to not discuss the details of your plans and ideas. Libra, the moon is moving into your star sign. You feel more comfortable and better able to deal with the opportunities and challenges that crop up in your daily life. And it has a lot to do with your adaptability. Although you have an inclination to do a lot of talking, typical Libra, there are benefits to keeping quiet. Scorpio, when dealing with other people, it's important to pick and choose. There are some people who can lift your spirits. Other people, though, can grind you to a halt. And being a Scorpio, you're usually a good judge of character, and if you're honest with yourself, you'll make the right decisions. Sagittarius, there are a lot of things that you hope for, and you're focusing on the sooner rather than the later. And whether your hopes can be fulfilled may rest on the human environment. You need support and encouragement, not criticism and complaint. Yet you also need sensible advice, and if you take your hands off your ears, you'll hear it. Capricorn, you're ready to engage with the world. You know how to do it, and you know what obstacles you'll face. And with Mercury still moving through your star sign, you'll be able to think things through and come to the right decision. But not everyone will like what you're doing, which really can't be helped. Aquarius, it's a complicated world, and some of the things you're seeing don't really make any sense, at least in the first instance. But there's no need to panic. The more you watch what's going on, the better your understanding of the situation. And at some stage, there'll be a moment of revelation when everything fits together. Pisces, everything happens for a reason. At least today it does. And unconnected events are all part of the wider picture. So if something doesn't go your way, don't automatically assume it's a problem. Wait for things to develop and let the connections start to form. And what starts as a problem could end up being very lucky for you. So now I'm going to turn to the I Ching. So, as always, I asked a question for the day. My question being, what is Wednesday going to be like for those watching this video? And I threw 3 coins 6 times, and I got this hexagram. Hexagram 30, the clinging. So the clinging is a double trigram. So remember, a trigram is the first 3 lines. A hexagram is 6 lines. A trigram is the 2 3-line groupings that the hexagram is composed of, and it's a double hexagram where you've got this top 3 lines, bottom 3 lines are the same, and it's sort of symbolic of the sun. It's symbolic of fire. It's about fire rising. It's about being able to see what's around us. It's about bright lights. It's about a situation where everything is illuminated, and if we take care of our talents and our abilities, then we can see something really amazing. Indeed, it's said with the clinging that the sun is rising twice, because you've got the sun top and the bottom, you've got the sun and the sun, so something can rise twice, and that's, so it's, in a way, it's really good. But we do have a moving line. The bottom line moves, and so the bottom line in a hexagram tends to relate to the beginning. It's the first movement. And so it's like we're at the beginning of a new project. And it's like setting out early in the morning. Maybe we're not fully awake. We don't fully know what's going on. We don't fully know what we're dealing with. So in this new project, we do have to be very careful. We need to watch where we step. It's easy to make mistakes. We haven't, I said we haven't properly woken up. We're not fully aware of the challenges that we're about to face. So we do need to take it. We do need to take it very slowly. It's not unfortunate. It's okay to be a bit confused, but we just have to make sure that we don't rush into something before we properly understand it. And this hexagram 30, the clinging, because the bottom line moves, it breaks. We move to a second hexagram, which is hexagram 56, which is the Wanderer. And it's a kind of a similar theme. We're involved in a new project, and we're involved in something new. It depends what you're coming into this video with. When you're, what is that? What is this issue? What is this new thing? This new thing might be, some new project you're working on. I don't know whether it's a hobby or whether it's something you're doing at work, or it could be a new relationship. It could be a new challenge. Whatever it is, you're not fully familiar with it. And so we get this hexagram, the Wanderer. The Wanderer does not have a secure base. The Wanderer is not fully grounded. So we're just wandering around this issue, this problem. We really don't seem to have much direction. So it's kind of a bit difficult to begin with. And we just have to accept the situation. The Wanderer can't take liberties. The Wanderer needs to be very aware of his or her vulnerabilities. And so that's how we need to handle things. Just not make assumptions. We need to wait for the next, for things to move on before we can finally start to settle ourselves. But we know if we accept our vulnerabilities and accept we don't understand the problem in front of us, or the task in front of us, or the challenge, whatever it is, we're still wandering. We're still not ready to fully take ownership of what we're doing. But keep plugging away. Have humility, and in the end, I think the situation will resolve itself, but maybe not today. Okay, so now I want to look at the astrology, and I want to look at Boris Johnson. So yes, I have looked at Boris Johnson's chart before several times, but I want to specifically look at Boris Johnson's chart in terms of his approach to Ukraine. He's no longer Prime Minister, but he very much spearheaded Britain's involvement in the Russia-Ukraine war. And he sort of encouraged, I think, other people, in other countries, even though Britain is not a member of the European Union anymore. He sort of became a sort of a rallying point for sort of other countries to get involved. I mean, particularly countries like Poland and the Baltic states, who were sort of enthusiastic in their opposition to Russia. Of course, things have changed now that Russia is starting to win its war. But at the time, 2022, it looked as if everything was disastrous for Russia, and he was very gung ho about it. So, what is it that made him so gung ho? Now, you could say that his premiership was in real trouble. Astrology aside, because of this, all this, the fallout, for example, for this party he had in number 10 Downing Street. I'm sure that wasn't the whole problem. There were other things going on. So, Ukraine was perhaps a good issue. Perhaps, I don't know, maybe he was reasoning this would boost his support at home, because certainly it seemed to be very popular in the UK to begin with. So that might have been part of it. But okay, so looking at his natal chart, what might explain it? I think the fact that he has no fire in his chart might help explain it. Because look at the fire signs. He's got Sagittarius, Leo, Aries. They're empty, and so a lot of people who've got no fire in their chart, they like to compensate. They want to look for that fire elsewhere. Where's the excitement? Where's the action? Where's this thing I can get my teeth into? Now, you could say, for example, in 2016, in the run-up to the referendum on Brexit, at some level, almost an unconscious level, maybe Boris was thinking, where is the fire? Where is the action? Maybe the action was in those advocating for Brexit, those who wanted to remain a bit too staid. That's not really where the excitement is. So perhaps it was that lack of fire which encouraged him to go for where the action is in 2016. Then you've got Russia invading Ukraine. That is certainly where the action is. That's where you want to go. And with all of that action and excitement, do you really want to have a look at these talks in Istanbul, just when the war is starting to get going, just when you've seen all these reports in the Western media about how incompetent and useless the Russians are, and then sure, Ukraine's surely going to roll over them, and then you've got these talks in Istanbul between Ukraine and Russia, which there's some chance that they're going to actually agree something. Is that really what you want? That's kind of a bit boring, isn't it? And then you've got his Gemini. He's got Mars, Mercury, Sun, Venus in Gemini. Where's the excitement? Gemini gets bored. So perhaps, there is a certain excitement there. And I know I'm being a bit frivolous here. Let's not forget the human cost of this war. Hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians have been killed in this war. A lot of Russians have been killed too, but many more Ukrainians. If this war had been stopped at the Istanbul talks in the spring of 2022, a huge amount of lives would have been saved. So it's perhaps easy to be flippant. If you're a politician with all that Gemini, Gemini can sometimes just forget the human element. It can be a mental exercise, and that may have been part of it. Now, as far as the death is concerned, hundreds of thousands of people killed. Now, we don't know how it worked. Okay, Boris Johnson went to Kiev April the 9th, 2019. Sorry, April the 9th, 2022, and Ukraine pulled out. There was no agreement with Russia. We don't know quite what his responsibility was. We don't know quite who he had been talking to before he went to Kiev. So we don't know the full details. But we are getting evidence left, right, and centre that he did probably play quite a big role in the immediate thing of ending those peace talks with this mission, with him going to Kiev. So and as a result of that, a lot of people died. And he has got, we can see he's got his Mars at 1 degree Gemini. He's got Saturn at 5 degrees Pisces. He does have a Mars-Saturn square. Now Mars and Saturn are the death pair. Okay, they can also be connected with delays and frustrations. And he has the planet Kronos. It's a hypothetical planet. Let me just show you what I mean. If you're into hypothetical planets, let me just show you what I mean. There's Kronos. You see, the Mars-Saturn midpoint is at around 18 Aries. So you can see that Kronos is 45 degrees from his Mars-Saturn midpoint. Now, Kronos is about government. And so as he's got Kronos semi-square his Mars-Saturn midpoint, government and death, how governments react to death, how governments are perhaps involved with death. And I think in the COVID crisis, he was Prime Minister of Britain during the COVID crisis, during the high point of the COVID crisis. He was very sick himself. I think there was some possibility he might have actually died from COVID. And he was Prime Minister of a country where a lot of people were dying of COVID. And so perhaps someone with Kronos semi-square of the Mars-Saturn midpoint, that kind of fits. Said Kronos is like a higher, I don't even know. I suppose a higher version of Saturn. I don't even know. Maybe not even higher. It's kind of similar to Saturn. Obviously, in Greek, the Greek for Saturn is Kronos, relates to time. But in Uranian astrology, Kronos is very much connected with government. And so perhaps him as in government dealing with the COVID crisis does fit. And then him as Prime Minister going to Kiev, to presumably encourage these talks to break off, and to offer support, military support, not just from Britain, I think, but from NATO and so forth, to Zelensky and the Ukrainian government. That's what they needed to keep going with the war, and then that's it. Kronos on the Mars-Saturn midpoint, so that sort of strikes again. So I think that Mars-Saturn midpoint is sort of very much in play there. Another thing about Boris Johnson is, Boris Johnson, he's quite an optimistic person. One of his strengths as a politician was that he was a very good campaigner. I mean, interestingly, the prime minister before him, who was a very good campaigner, who was good at getting elected, was Tony Blair, and it's interesting that now, Tony Blair's reputation, how the history books see him, if you like, has been seriously blemished by Britain's involvement in the 2003 Iraq war. Remember, looking for weapons of mass destruction. Tony Blair, I think, in retrospect, made a huge mistake there. And of course, as a result of Britain and America's going into Iraq, a lot of Iraqis died, hundreds of thousands, and that certainly damaged Tony Blair's reputation. But Boris Johnson is optimistic, and I think it has something to do with his Jupiter-Neptune, may have something to do partly with his Jupiter-Neptune opposition. Jupiter is an optimistic planet, and its opposition Neptune, it's a fantasy that everything's going to be fine. Maybe that's how he was seeing the war that Ukraine was getting involved with. Plus the fact that Britain has got its imperial legacy, its imperial history, and if you're British, you're very much influenced. Well, maybe not of the latest generation, certainly my generation. You think always thinking back about the Second World War, and that despite the odds, plucky Britain, Dunkirk spirit, we were able to win through. Britain generally wins its wars. Okay, we lost in the Revolutionary War against the US, but by and large, we're very, Britons are proud of their military tradition. And the Falklands War, the odds were against Britain in the Falklands War, and we know this, having to send this task force thousands of miles across the world, and it was okay. And so there's this feeling that when Britain gets involved in a military adventure, it's going to be okay in the end. And I'm wondering, with that Jupiter-Neptune opposition, maybe that's what he was thinking. Part of it's going to be okay in the end, and of course that's what that's probably what he was told as well. So I think that the optimism of that Jupiter-Neptune Jupiter-Neptune opposition was probably having quite a big impact there. Then there's one other thing about his chart, which is kind of different. We look at his Gemini, and we get transfixed by his 4 planets in Gemini, but then we forget, or we could forget, that he's got Moon in Scorpio. That Moon in Scorpio is a very different energy from Gemini, all those planets in Gemini. Having a Moon in the first degree of Scorpio, it's a terrible place for the Moon, and it's a place of the Moon that can be quite cruel. I know it's a water sign, but it can be unfeeling. It can be quite vicious. So this optimistic, bumptious Boris Johnson, that's the image we get. Libra rising, all those planets in Gemini, but behind the mask, there is that Moon in Scorpio, stubborn, vindictive, perhaps even having grudges. Now, Moon in Scorpio is more about him as a younger man, but maybe because in the male chart, the Moon is often very strong as a child, but as soon as one hits one's early 20s, one transitions from the Moon to the Sun. But that Moon in Scorpio suggests a very different picture, and in order to really understand that Moon in Scorpio and how relevant it is to Boris Johnson and Ukraine and his visit to Kiev and his relationship to Zelensky, it might be a good idea to relocate his chart. So we're going to keep that time. He was born in New York. But we're going to reset the chart for Kiev. So we're going to relocate it. Oh, sorry, I've got my keyboard down here. we're going to relocate it to Kiev in the Ukraine. Okay, same chart, June the 19th, 1964, same time, but instead of New York, I've set it for Kiev. And look at the midheaven. The midheaven is at 037 Scorpio. In other words, the moon is exactly on the midheaven. That means that when baby Boris was born, that moment that baby Boris was born in New York, in Kiev, the moon was exactly on the midheaven. And that means that whole meridian, the moon meridian, let me just show you the map, an astro map of the world for Boris. There's the moon, you see there? That's a moon on the midheaven. Everything on down that line. And that line goes exactly through Kiev. And that's why he's so pulled to that place. In fact, it's not just he's got moon on the midheaven. His Sun-Venus conjunction is on the descendant in Kiev. So he gets really pulled to that place. And, I just remember seeing those pictures of him visiting Kiev I think it was on the 9th. People just really warmed to him. He had a good trip. Everyone was happy to see him. It was quite touching. And so, Kiev was his place. So you have a war. Russia invades his country with Kiev as its capital. So it's not surprising that Boris got so involved with Kiev. The moon is the general public, but we mustn't forget that that moon is in Scorpio, the sign of its fall. It's like, in a way, the worst aspect of his personality is given complete precedence in Kiev. It brings out that, you could argue that city brings out the absolute worst in him. Going into this war without thinking about the human consequences, and so now I want to consider perhaps how Boris relates to Ukraine. Okay, we already know that he's got moon on the midheaven in Ukraine. I was going to say that if Boris had changed his citizenship, got Ukrainian passport, he'd do very well in Ukrainian politics, particularly as he's a good linguist. I'm sure he'd pick up the language pretty quickly. But then I think people would realize that he was a representative of the West, and the West has basically shown absolute contempt for the Ukrainian population. Up to 500,000 Ukrainians killed in that war. I think someone came up with a statistic. Was it something like 2% of every Ukrainian man has been killed? 2% of males, is that the thing? So anyway, that's the moon on the midheaven. So how does he relate to Ukraine itself? We'll look at. So this is inside. We've got the horoscope of Ukraine. On the outside, we've got the horoscope of Boris Johnson. So remember, Boris Johnson has this Jupiter-Neptune opposition, which I've said is about his optimistic fantasies. And there is Ukraine's midheaven, 13 Scorpio, 13 Taurus, Pluto on the midheaven. And so his Jupiter-Neptune opposition is right on Ukraine's midheaven. The midheaven is where Ukraine wants to go. And so Johnson comes along with saying, yeah, we're going to support you, it's going to be fine. has an optimism about the war. And Ukraine almost, they kind of believe him because he's got his Neptune on the midheaven. Boris's Neptune, yeah, they fall for it. So that's one aspect of how he might be impacting Ukraine. Then there's his Mars. So you can see that his Mars is at 1 degree, 1 degree Gemini. So his Mars is square their Sun. So Mars, his aggression is square Ukraine's Sun, and so perhaps that indicates the war that Boris helped Ukraine not just get involved with, but commit itself to. Remember, there was this potential of this peace treaty in Istanbul, of the war actually ending. So those are a few ways in which Boris's chart links with Ukraine's chart. Then we've got his visit to Kiev, which a lot of people are talking about. A lot of people are saying that this is the moment. This is the moment where Boris supposedly put pressure on them when he went there. Was he an emissary? I don't know. Was he just a message boy? I don't know. So let's look at the trip to Kiev. I tried to find out exactly what time he met Zelensky, so I couldn't really find it. So this is a chart that I don't have the time, but I've gone for noon, April 9th, 2022 in Kiev. Notice at this time there's a Jupiter-Neptune conjunction. So Boris had a close Jupiter-Neptune opposition in his chart, which suggests he might be quite sensitive to the Jupiter-Neptune cycle. So he went to Kiev with the Jupiter-Neptune conjunction. So normally in his chart, Jupiter-Neptune opposition, there's a struggle to be optimistic. There's a struggle to see the best to see the absolute best in any situation. Then he goes to Kiev when there's a Jupiter-Neptune conjunction. So it all comes together for Boris. So his optimism, his fantasies of a quick victory, fantasies of defeating Russia, and there's the Jupiter-Neptune conjunction at the time he was meeting Zelensky. On the other hand, we also need to remember that Boris Johnson has a Mars-Saturn square. And when he went to Kiev, on that day, well, it lasted for a bit of time, the conjunction, but there's a Mars-Saturn conjunction. Remember Mars-Saturn are the death pair, and that's what was that's what was happening when he went to Kiev. So those are a few things going on when he visited the city. It's also worth noting that there was a Sun-Venus semi-square. Sun was at 1932 Aries. That may be important. Sun at 1932 Aries, because the Sun was fairly close to his Mars-Saturn midpoint. So, Boris has the Mars-Saturn square. That is the capacity to be involved in a situation where there is a lot of destruction. And so the Sun was within just over a degree of the midpoint of his Mars-Saturn square. and Venus was involved in it too, because Venus was semi-square Sun. So he had Sun and Venus aspecting his Mars-Saturn square. And so, his involvement with this Ukraine drama war, this war that in the end has led to so many, hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians dying. Maybe that's also connected with the Sun on his Mars-Saturn midpoint. I also, and I sort of wanted to sort of finish up by looking at how his trip to Kiev, how it actually impacted Ukraine. Here's a chart for Ukraine in the middle. And there is on the outer wheel is the chart for Boris's visit to Kiev. So a couple of interesting things are going on here. Remember, there was a Jupiter-Neptune conjunction. Approximately. I mean, it wasn't exact on that day, but this was a time when there was a Jupiter-Neptune opposite conjunction in the sky. And there's Ukraine's Mars, 25 Virgo. So Mars, if you're Ukraine, what Mars represents your fighting force, it's your aggression, how you're going to deal with the enemy. And so the Jupiter-Neptune conjunction was sort of vaguely opposition Ukraine's Mars. So I think at this time there was this fantasy in Ukraine that they could actually prevail against Russia, and of course the fantasy also that aid from the West and NATO was going to be enough to help them prevail against Russia, and so Jupiter-Neptune. Roughly at this time was on their Mars, and then Boris comes along, who's got a Jupiter-Neptune opposition in his chart, and he's the one who helps them really believe that they can do what, certainly in retrospect, was completely impossible. Then look at Uranus. Uranus is at 1320 Taurus, so very close to Uranus's IC, the bottom of their chart, the foundations of the country. And so really, Uranus is the thing that breaks things up. It's a planet of earthquakes. And so, they were, they had these talks in Istanbul. They were going, I think they were going well. I mean, I think the deal that Ukraine got was really good. I mean, I think in a way, the Russians, they were giving away everything. I mean, they were not quite everything, but they were prepared to almost go back to the status quo antebellum. As far as I understand it, and then then Ukraine could sort of do whatever it want. The Ukrainians, they're very good at saying one thing and using words, and they'd be able to sort of make the most of this deal. They might be able to break it in a subtle kind of way, and all this kind of stuff. Yeah, it was really great. So in a way, by breaking this deal, this agreement, that by not agreeing with the Russians at Istanbul, they were sort of really snatching, what is it? Snatching defeat from the jaws of victory. No, yeah, it was they had it. They'd done really well in Istanbul, and it's all taken away. They pulled out, which was really a disastrous thing to do. And there's Uranus. At that moment, Uranus was on Ukraine's IC, and in the end would turn out to shatter the country's very very foundations. So I think this is a difficult chart. And one other thing, there was a Saturn Mars conjunction at the time of Boris's visit to Kiev, and look at there's Ukraine's moon, 22.9 Aquarius. So Saturn was pretty close to Ukraine's moon, and Mars was also conjunct. So the Saturn-Mars conjunction was on Ukraine's moon, and the moon represents, the people. Saturn-Mars conjunction, you could say like is death of the populace. So yeah, I think that's just a really difficult chart, and I think that if it is the case that Boris's visit to Kiev was the end, they caused them not to have an agreement with the Russians. If it was at this point that Ukraine committed itself to a war that would lead to hundreds of thousands of casualties, and a war which in the end they really weren't going to win. And I think we see this now as the war is increasingly turning in Russia's favor. So the idea that this chart, that visit of Boris to Kiev, was a moment where Ukraine started down the path to total destruction, I think that fits. But particularly that Uranus on the IC, it seems slow. It didn't seem very. The IC is quite a hidden part of the chart. But there's Uranus causing that fundamental disruption. So I think looking at Boris, I think overall we can see in his chart, in the chart of when he visited Kiev on April the 9th, in the fact that when he was born, the moon was exactly on the midheaven in Kiev, moon in Scorpio. I mean, I think that we can see astrologically why Boris has been so closely connected with Ukraine, and I think it also shows us why Boris has been why Boris has actually ended up causing a huge amount of damage to Ukraine, and why I think in the end Boris will be judged very poorly by historians, not because of his behavior during the COVID crisis, but because of his behavior towards Ukraine, and for him not really thinking it through. And I think being one of the people that has contributed to the destruction of Ukraine, or certainly for a large for hundreds of thousands of its population. Okay, thank you for listening, and I will talk to you again tomorrow.